Welcome to Elizabeth's Stories. Today, we follow Margaret Walsh, a retired teacher uncovering her son's faked death and a sinister plot by his wife. She outsmarts criminals, protects her family, and discovers her strength. Subscribe and hit the bell for weekly tales of courage and truth. Share below. Let's start. The air in the funeral parlor was thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken grief, a suffocating blend that clung to my black wool dress like a second skin. I stood beside the closed mahogany casket, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow of chandeliers overhead, a silent monument to a loss I couldn't yet fathom. My son Danny was inside, or so they told me. The mourners shuffled past their faces, blurred by my tears, offering murmured condolences that felt like static in my ears. I was Margaret Walsh, 67, a retired English teacher who'd spent 4 decades shaping young minds, now reduced to a mother, staring at her son's supposed grave. But something was wrong. I could feel it, a prickling unease that crawled up my spine like a spider. Stephanie, my daughter-in-law, stood to my left, her sobs loud and theatrical, her perfectly manicured hands clutching a lace handkerchief. She'd insisted on a closed casket, claiming the car accident that took Danny was too gruesome for an open viewing. "You shouldn't see him like this." Margaret, she'd wailed over the phone, her voice cracking with rehearsed precision. "Let me spare you that pain." I'd nodded then, too shattered to argue, but now standing here, her words felt hollow, like lines from a play she'd memorized too well. The room was a sea of black-clad figures, neighbors, former students, distant cousins, all paying respects to a son I'd raised alone after his father vanished when he was 6. Danny had been my anchor, my reason to keep going through years of grading papers and scraping by. He'd grown into a kind, trusting man with his father's easy smile and my stubborn heart. But now that heart was supposedly still burned beyond recognition in a fiery wreck. I pressed my trembling fingers against the casket's cool surface, searching for a connection, a whisper of the boy I'd lost. Nothing came. Then my phone buzzed in my purse, a sharp vibration that jolted me from my grief. I ignored it, at first assuming it was another condolence text from a well-meaning friend. But it buzzed again, insistent like a wasp trapped in a jar. With a glance at Stephanie, who was busy dabbing her eyes for the benefit of a nearby mourner, I slipped my hand into my purse and pulled out the phone. The screen glowed with a message from an unknown number, and as I read the words, the world tilted beneath me. "Mom, I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin. Don't trust Stephanie." My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of a pew to steady myself. The words burned into my retinas, impossible, absurd, yet pulsing with a truth I couldn't ignore. My heart, which had been a leaden weight in my chest, lurched to life, hammering against my ribs. I read the message again, my breath shallow, searching for a sign it was a cruel prank. But who would know to call me Mom? Who would mention Stephanie by name? The room spun, the mourners' voices, fading into a distant hum, as if I'd slipped into a parallel world where nothing made sense. I forced myself to look at Stephanie. She was still performing, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with practiced sorrow. But now I saw her differently. The tilt of her head, the way her fingers tightened around that handkerchief, it was too perfect, too controlled. An actress on a stage, playing to an audience of one. Me. My instincts, honed by years of spotting lies and teenagers' excuses, screamed that something was terribly wrong. But grief is a fog that clouds even the sharpest mind, and I'd been drowning in it for days. Had I missed the signs? Had I ignored the warnings? I typed a response, my fingers trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "Where are you? What's happening?" I hit send, holding my breath, half expecting the message to bounce back or vanish into the ether. But the reply came instantly cold and urgent. Can't explain now. They're watching. Meet me at the old Miller farm tomorrow. 3:00 p.m. Come alone. Don't trust Stephanie. They're watching. The words sent a chill through me, as if unseen eyes were boring into my back. I glanced around the room, searching for a face that didn't belong, a gaze that lingered too long. The mourners seemed ordinary Mrs. Peterson from down the street, my old colleague from the high school, a cousin I hadn't seen in years, but the air felt charged heavy with secrets. Was someone here part of this? Was Stephanie not alone in her charade? I slipped the phone back into my purse, my hands shaking so violently I fumbled with the clasp. Stephanie's head snapped up her eyes, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Margaret, are you okay?" she asked, her voice dripping with concern, but her gaze was sharp, calculating like a predator sizing up its prey. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a weak smile, just overwhelmed. My voice sounded foreign, brittle, but she seemed to accept it, patting my arm with a tenderness that felt like a violation. "You're so strong," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "Danny would be proud of you." Her words were a knife twisting in my gut. Proud of me. For standing here mourning a son who might be alive. For trusting her when every fiber of my being screamed to run. I nodded, playing the part of the grieving mother while my mind raced. The Miller farm. Danny used to sneak there as a teenager, thinking I didn't know taking girls to the abandoned barn under the guise of stargazing. It was a place of secrets, 20 acres of overgrown fields and crumbling wood, perfect for hiding or for traps. If Danny was alive, why was he there? Why fake his death? And who were they? The funeral parlor felt smaller now, the walls closing in the lily's perfume choking me. I excused myself, murmuring something about needing air, and stepped outside into the gray drizzle of the afternoon. The cold bit at my face, grounding me as I leaned against the brick wall and reread the texts. Each word was a lifeline pulling me from despair into a dangerous unknown. My son was alive, or someone wanted me to believe he was. Either way, I was no longer just a mourner. I was a mother with a mission. I returned to the parlor, steeling myself to face Stephanie again. She was still at the casket, now surrounded by a cluster of mourners offering their sympathies. Her eyes flicked to me as I re-entered a fleeting glance that held something darker than grief, suspicion perhaps, or fear. I forced myself to mingle accepting hugs and whispered words, all while my mind churned. The casket was empty, or so the text claimed. Was it weighted with sandbags, a mannequin? Nothing at all. The thought was grotesque, but it fueled my resolve. If Danny was out there, I would find him. If this was a lie, I would uncover it. As the service ended, Stephanie clung to my arm, her grip tighter than necessary. "We'll get through this together." "Margaret," she said, her voice soft but edged with something I couldn't name. "Danny would want us to lean on each other." I patted her hand, mirroring her false warmth. "Of course, dear." I said, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. But as we walked out into the rain, her fingers lingering on my arm, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer her pawn. The game had changed, and I was ready to play. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I drove home, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the windshield, my thoughts a tangle of hope and dread. The text had come from Danny's number, but phones could be stolen messages faked. Yet the mention of the Miller farm was too specific a detail only Danny and I would know. I wanted to believe he was alive, but belief was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not yet. That night I sat in my darkened living room, the glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. My late husband's armchair sat empty across from me, a reminder of another loss I'd survived. I'd buried him 20 years ago, and the pain had taught me resilience. But this was different. This was a betrayal wrapped in a mystery, and I was no longer the trusting widow I'd been. I was a mother, and mothers don't break when their children need them. I opened my phone again, staring at the texts until my eyes burned. The words hadn't changed, but their weight grew heavier with each passing hour. They're watching. Who were they? Stephanie's allies, strangers. The shadows in my house seemed to shift, and every creak of the old floorboards set my nerves on edge. I checked the locks, twice, drew the curtains tight, and placed my phone on the coffee table like a loaded gun. Tomorrow, at the Miller farm, I would face whatever truth or lie awaited me. As I lay in bed, sleep eluding me, I thought of Danny's laugh, his boyish grin, the way he'd always trusted too easily. Had that trust led him into danger? Had Stephanie exploited it, weaving a web I'd failed to see? The questions gnawed at me, but beneath them burned a spark of something new, something fierce. I was Margaret Walsh, and I had spent 42 years outsmarting teenagers who thought they could outwit me. Whoever was behind this, whatever they wanted, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The rain tapped against my window, a restless rhythm that matched my pulse. Tomorrow I would walk into the unknown, armed only with a mother's love and a teacher's cunning. The casket might be empty, but my resolve was not. This was no longer just a funeral. It was the beginning of a fight. The rain had stopped by the time I drove home from the funeral parlor, but the world outside my old Honda felt drenched in shadow. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the cryptic text from Danny, or someone claiming to be him, burning in my mind like a fever. Mom, I'm alive. Don't trust Stephanie. The words looped endlessly, each repetition pulling me deeper into a maze of doubt and hope. As I navigated the familiar streets of our small town, my thoughts drifted back, searching for the threads that had led to this moment. To understand the present, I had to unravel the past piece by piece, like a poem whose meaning only reveals itself after careful study. I'm Margaret Walsh, 67, a woman who'd spent 42 years teaching high school English, coaxing reluctant teenagers to find truth in Shakespeare and solace in Dickinson. I'd retired 2 years ago, trading chalkboards for volunteer shifts at the library, but the rhythm of my life hadn't changed much. I was still the steady one, the one who fixed things, scraped knees, broken hearts, late-night crises. I'd raised Danny alone after his father Tom walked out when Danny was 6, leaving behind a note that said, "I'm not built for this." I was. I'd built a life for us brick by brick, through long nights grading papers and longer days worrying about a boy who wore his heart too openly. Danny was my light, my miracle. He had his father's charm, but none of his cowardice, a boy who'd grown into a man with a laugh that could fill a room and a trust that sometimes worried me. He saw the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That's why 3 years ago, when he introduced me to Stephanie, I tried to see what he saw. She was radiant blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, a smile that promised warmth, a quick wit that matched Danny's. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, like a chess player sizing up the board. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to a mother's overprotectiveness. Danny was happy, and I wanted to believe in that happiness. They'd married in a small ceremony at the town hall, Stephanie in a simple white dress that seemed almost too modest, as if she were playing a role. I stood in the back, smiling through my unease, telling myself I was being unfair. But the red flags were there, small at first, like cracks in a foundation. Stephanie had a way of inserting herself between Danny and me, subtle but deliberate. Phone calls grew shorter, visits less frequent. "Oh, Danny's just busy with work," she'd say when I asked to speak with him, her voice sweet but edged with control. She'd answer his texts for him, sign his name on Christmas cards, decide which family events he'd attend. I bit my tongue, not wanting to be the meddling mother-in-law, but each interaction left a residue of doubt, like dust settling on a forgotten book. 2 weeks before the funeral, Danny called me late at night, his voice crackling with an excitement I hadn't heard in years. Mom Stephanie and I are going into real estate development. He said the words tumbling out. We found this incredible opportunity in Florida. It's big, life-changing money. I could hear Stephanie in the background, her voice a soft murmur guiding the conversation even from a distance. Just be careful, sweetheart, I said, my mother's instinct prickling like a storm on the horizon. These investment schemes can be risky. It's not a scheme, Mom. He replied, his laugh forced as if he were trying to convince himself as much as me. Stephanie's really good with numbers. She's figured it all out. I wanted to press him to ask what figuring it out meant, but the call ended abruptly, Stephanie's voice cutting in to say they had another meeting. That was the last time I heard from him until the funeral. The last time I heard his voice alive and hopeful before the world turned upside down. The call that shattered me came a week later at dawn, when the sky was still bruised with night. Stephanie's voice was hysterical, her words tripping over sobs. Margaret, it's Danny. There was an accident, a car crash. The vehicle? It caught fire. He's gone. I don't remember much of what followed, only the way the phone slipped from my hand, the way the room seemed to collapse inward. She said the body was too burned to identify, that she'd handle the funeral arrangements. I can't bear for you to see him like that. She'd wailed, please let me protect you from this horror. Her grief sounded real, but there was something off, like a note played slightly out of tune. I agreed to the closed casket against every instinct, screaming to see my boy, to touch his face one last time. Grief makes you doubt yourself, makes you question the warnings your heart tries to send. Now sitting in my quiet house, the memory of that call felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Stephanie's tears, her insistence on controlling every detail, had it all been part of a performance? I stood and paced the living room, my footsteps muffled by the worn rug, my eyes drifting to the photos on the mantel. Danny, at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a soccer ball. Danny at 18 in his graduation cap, his arm slung around my shoulders. Danny and Stephanie on their wedding day, her smile radiant, but her eyes distant, like she was already looking past him, to something else. I thought back to the months before the accident, searching for clues I'd missed. There was the time Stephanie brought over a stack of legal documents, her voice honeyed as she explained they were for Danny's life insurance and estate planning. He wants to make sure you're taking care of Margaret, she'd said, handing me a pen. I'd signed without reading closely, trusting her because Danny trusted her. Had that been the first step in her plan? Had she been weaving a web around us from the moment she entered our lives? Then there was the land in Colorado, a detail I'd almost forgotten until now. My father Joe had left me 40 acres of Rocky Mountain terrain when he died 20 years ago. It was worthless, or so I'd thought, a patch of scrubland I'd never even visited. I paid the property taxes out of habit, a small annual ritual to honor his memory. Danny had mentioned it once, years ago, joking that we should build a cabin there someday. Had Stephanie known about it? Had she seen something in that land that I hadn't? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to shift, forming a picture I wasn't ready to face. Stephanie's charm, her control, her sudden interest in Danny's finances, it all pointed to something deliberate, something planned. But what and why fake Danny's death? The text had mentioned they a shadowy group watching us. Were they her allies? Her employers? The thought sent a shiver through me, as if the walls of my home were no longer a sanctuary, but a stage for someone else's script. I sank into my late husband's armchair, the leather creaking under my weight. Tom had left me to face the world alone, But he'd also taught me resilience, even if it was through his absence. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to see through lies, to stand firm when the world tried to push me down. Those instincts were screaming now, louder than ever. Stephanie wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a player in a game I didn't yet understand. And Danny my Danny was either a victim or a pawn. The Miller farm loomed in my mind, its abandoned fields, a beacon of hope and danger. I hadn't been there in years, but I could still picture its sagging barn, its rusted gates, the way the wind whispered through the tall grass. It was a place of secrets, a place where Danny had once hidden his teenage rebellions. Was he hiding there now, or was I being lured into a trap? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but so did the spark of possibility. If Danny was alive, I would find him. If he wasn't, I would find the truth. I stood and crossed to the window, peering through the curtains at the empty street. The lampposts cast pools of light on the wet pavement, but the darkness between them felt alive, watchful. I thought of Stephanie's performance at the funeral, her tears that never smudged her makeup, her grip that felt more like a warning than a comfort. I thought of Danny's voice on that last call, bright with hope, but tinged with something else, fear perhaps, or doubt. I dismissed it then, but now it echoed like a warning bell. My life had been a series of battles, each fought quietly but fiercely. Raising Danny alone, teaching classrooms full of restless teens, surviving the loneliness of widowhood. Each had shaped me into someone stronger than I'd ever realized. But this was different. This was a mystery wrapped in betrayal, a puzzle with stakes higher than any I'd faced before. I wasn't just Margaret Walsh, retired teacher and doting mother. I was a woman who'd spent decades reading between the lines, spotting truths hidden in plain sight. And I was ready to use every lesson I'd learned to protect what was mine. As I turned off the lamp and headed to bed, the house settled around me, its creaks and groans a familiar lullaby. But sleep was a distant hope. My mind churned with questions, each one a thread in a tapestry I was only beginning to see. Who was watching us? What did Stephanie want? And most importantly, where was my son? Tomorrow at the Miller farm, I would step into the unknown, armed with nothing but a mother's love and a teacher's cunning. The shadows could watch all they wanted. I was watching back. The next day dawned gray and heavy, the sky a bruised canvas that mirrored my restless heart. I'd barely slept, the cryptic texts from Danny, or whoever was using his phone haunting me like lines from a half-forgotten poem. Mom, I'm alive. Don't trust Stephanie. Meet me at the old Miller farm tomorrow. 3:00 p.m. Come alone. The words were a lifeline, and a trap pulling me toward hope and danger in equal measure. As I sipped my morning coffee, the kitchen clock ticking toward noon, I felt the weight of the unknown pressing against me. The Miller farm was 15 miles out of town, a place of crumbling barns and whispered secrets. If Danny was there, I would find him. If this was a lie, I would face it. Either way, I was no longer the grieving mother who'd stood beside an empty casket. I was Margaret Walsh, and I was ready to fight. The drive to the Miller farm was a blur of winding roads and skeletal trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. My old Honda rattled over the dirt path, kicking up dust that swirled like ghosts in my rearview mirror. The farm had been abandoned for decades, its fields overtaken by tall grass, and its buildings sagging under the weight of neglect. Danny used to come here as a teenager, sneaking out to meet girls or friends thinking I didn't know. I always knew. A mother's intuition is sharper than any spy's, and I'd let him have his secrets trusting he'd come to me if he needed me. Now he needed me more than ever, or so the text claimed. I parked behind the old barn, its faded red paint peeling like old wounds. The air was still too still, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. I scanned the horizon, searching for movement, for a sign of Danny or danger. My hand rested on the door handle, my pulse hammering in my ears. They're watching. The warning echoed, making every shadow suspect. I stepped out of the car, my sensible black flats sinking into the damp earth, and pulled my coat tighter against the chill. The barn loomed ahead, its door ajar, a dark mouth waiting to swallow me whole. "Danny," I called, softly, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer, only the rustle of wind through the grass. I took a step forward, then another, my senses on high alert. The barn smelled of mildew and decay, its interior cloaked in gloom. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand brushing the splintered wood of the doorframe. If this was a trap, I was walking right into it. But if Danny was here, I had no choice. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a familiar gait that stopped my heart. Even in the dim light, I knew him, the slope of his shoulders, the way he held his head. It was Danny, my son, alive and breathing, his face pale, but unmistakable. He rushed toward me, pulling me into a fierce hug that banished all doubt. His warmth, his heartbeat, his scent of cedar and sweat, it was real. My boy was alive. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking against my hair. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to go through that funeral." I pulled back, searching his face for answers. His eyes were haunted, older than they'd been just weeks ago, shadowed by something darker than grief. "Danny, what's happening? Why did you let me think you were dead?" My voice cracked, torn between relief and anger. "Who's watching us? And what does Stephanie have to do with this?" He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting the shadows to move. "We can't stay here long," he said, guiding me deeper into the barn, where a rusted tractor offered a semblance of cover. "They're dangerous, Mom. Stephanie's not who she seems. She's working with people who want me gone permanently." I sat on a dusty crate, my legs unsteady, as Danny began to unravel a story that turned my world inside out. It started with Stephanie, the woman I'd tried to love for his sake. 3 years ago, she'd swept into his life like a summer storm, all charm and promises, her smile a mask for something colder. Danny had fallen hard-blinded by her confidence and ambition, but it wasn't love that drove her. It was the land in Colorado, those 40 acres my father had left me, the ones I'd dismissed as worthless. Stephanie had done her research long before she met Danny, uncovering a surveyor's report that revealed a natural gas reserve beneath the land worth millions, maybe tens of millions. She knew about it before we even met. Danny said, his voice bitter with self-reproach. "She targeted me, Mom. Our whole marriage was a lie, a way to get to you and that land." My blood ran cold. I remembered the stack of papers Stephanie had brought me a month ago, her voice smooth as she explained they were for Danny's life insurance and estate planning. I'd signed them, trusting her not reading closely enough. "What did I sign, Danny?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. "She forged documents to make it look like you transferred the land to me as part of your estate planning. Then she had me sign papers making her my sole heir if anything happened to me. If I'm dead, she gets everything." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The closed casket, the car accident, the fire that conveniently left no body to identify it was all part of her plan. "So, she staged your death," I said, my voice steady, despite the rage building inside me, "to claim the land." Danny nodded, his eyes darting to the barn door. "But it's worse than that. The people she's working with, they're not just con artists. They're criminals, Mom. They've done this before, targeting older people with valuable assets they don't even know they have." I overheard her on the phone talking about my accident, planning the funeral before it even happened. I realized I had hours, maybe less, before they made their move. "So you disappeared," I said, piecing it together. "You faked your death to buy time." I had to, he said, his voice cracking. If they knew I was alive, they'd come after you to force me out of hiding. I couldn't let that happen. I studied his face, seeing the boy I'd raised beneath the man he'd become. He was scared, but resolute. His trust shattered, but his love for me intact. Whose body is in the casket, Danny? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nobody's, he said. It's weighted with sandbags. I paid a guy at the morgue to help me stage it. I needed them to believe I was gone, at least until I could figure out how to stop them. The audacity of it stunned me, but so did his courage. My son, who'd always been too trusting, had outsmarted a group of criminals, even if only temporarily. But the danger was far from over. Stephanie and her allies thought he was dead, but they were still watching me, waiting for me to hand over the land. And now they'd given me a meeting place, the Miller farm, where Danny was supposed to be hiding. Had they followed me? Were they here now? I glanced at the barn door, the sliver of daylight narrowing as clouds thickened overhead. Danny, how did you send that text without them knowing? And who are they? He hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear. I stole my phone back from Stephanie's purse when I realized what she was planning. I've been using a burner SIM card, but I don't know how long I can stay off their radar. They are her partners, people she calls investors, but they're more like enforcers. I don't know their names, but I've seen them. Cold eyes expensive, suits the kind of people who don't ask twice. My mind raced, conjuring images of faceless men in the shadows, their motives as murky as the barn's gloom. What do they want with the land, I asked. Just the money, Danny shook his head. It's not just about selling it. The gas reserve is tied to a bigger operation, pipelines maybe, or something shadier. Stephanie's not the mastermind. She's their front, the one who gets close to people like us. They've been watching us for years, Mom. They knew about the land before we did. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Years. Stephanie had been playing a long game, weaving herself into our lives with surgical precision. Every dinner, every smile, every moment she'd spent with Danny, it had all been a lie. And I'd let her into our home, signed her papers, trusted her, because I wanted Danny to be happy. The betrayal cut deeper than grief, but it also ignited something fierce within me. Nobody threatened my son and walked away unscathed. What do we do now? I asked, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. They think you're dead, but they're still after the land. They'll come for me next. Danny's shoulders sagged, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. I don't know, Mom. I was hoping to find evidence, something to take to the police, but they're too careful. Everything's in Stephanie's name or hidden behind shell companies. I need your help. For 42 years, I'd protected Danny from every danger I could see bullies heartbreak bad decisions. But this was different. This was a conspiracy that spanned years, a web of lies that had ensnared us both. The teacher in me wanted to march him to the police, to let the law handle it. But the mother in me saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation of a man who'd risked everything to protect me. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a survivor, and he needed me to be one too. We'll find a way, I said, my voice firm. But first, we need to keep you safe. If they're watching, they can't know you're here. And we need to figure out what Stephanie's next move is. As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart sinking, as I saw Stephanie's name on the screen. A text, simple and chilling. Margaret, can you come over tonight? I found some of Danny's business papers we need to go over. It's important. I showed the message to Danny, whose face went pale. She's moving faster than I thought, he whispered. She must think you're still in the dark, that you'll sign whatever she puts in front of you. Then we let her think that I set a plan forming in my mind. I'll go to her tonight, play the grieving mother-in-law and see what she wants. If she's after the land, she'll tip her hand. And you stay here out of sight. Danny grabbed my arm. his grip tight with fear. Mom, these people aren't playing games. If they suspect you know anything, they won't hesitate to hurt you. I met his gaze, seeing the boy I'd raised in the man before me. Sweetheart, I've spent my life dealing with people who think they're smarter than me. Students, administrators, even your father. Stephanie and her friends have no idea who they're dealing with. He managed a weak smile, the first I'd seen since this nightmare began. You sound like you're about to give them a pop quiz they'll fail. Something like that, I said, my resolve hardening. But we need to be smart. If they're watching, we can't make any mistakes. Stay here, stay hidden, and don't use your phone unless it's an emergency. I'll be back after I see Stephanie. As I stood to leave, the barn seemed to close in around us, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. I hugged Danny again, memorizing the feel of him, the proof that he was alive. I love you. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. We're going to fix this. I love you too. Mom, he said, his voice breaking. Be careful. I stepped back into the daylight. The world outside the barn, stark and unforgiving. The air carried a faint metallic tang, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. I climbed into my car, my hands steady on the wheel despite the fear clawing at my chest. Stephanie's text was a summons, a move in a game I was only beginning to understand. But I was no longer a bystander. I was a mother, a teacher, a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life. And I was ready to turn their game against them. The drive back to town was a descent into a world I no longer recognized. Every car in my rearview mirror felt like a threat, every glance from a passerby a warning. Stephanie's house, where I'd soon face her, was a stage for her lies, but it would also be the place where I'd start unraveling them. I didn't know the full scope of her plan, but I knew one thing: she'd underestimated me. And that was her first mistake. The drive back from the Miller farm felt like a descent into a labyrinth, each turn of the road pulling me deeper into a world where trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. My son was alive, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned barn. His life hanging by a thread, spun from Stephanie's lies. Her text still glowed on my phone, a siren's call disguised as grief. Margaret, can you come over tonight? I found some of Danny's business papers we need to go over. It's important. The words were innocuous enough, but they carried a weight I could feel in my bones, a trap carefully set, waiting for me to step into it. But I was no longer the grieving mother she expected. I was Margaret Walsh, and I'd spent 42 years outsmarting teenagers who thought they could pull the wool over my eyes. Stephanie and her shadowy allies were about to learn what a retired English teacher could do when her son's life was at stake. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I pulled into my driveway, the street lamps casting long, wavering shadows across the pavement. My house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage for a performance I hadn't rehearsed. I checked the locks, twice, drew the curtains tight, and sat at the kitchen table. My phone beside a steaming mug of tea I had no intention of drinking. The plan forming in my mind was fragile, a house of cards built on instinct and desperation, but it was all I had. Stephanie wanted me to come to her house to sign papers that would likely seal the transfer of the Colorado land. If Danny was right, those papers were the final piece of her scheme to claim millions in natural gas reserves. I couldn't let that happen. But confronting her outright was too dangerous. She wasn't alone, and her investors were watching. I needed to play her game, but on my terms. I thought back to my teaching days, to the countless times I'd caught students cheating or lying their faces, a mix of bravado and fear. The key was always to let them think they were in control, to let their overconfidence be their downfall. Stephanie was no different. She saw me as a grieving, gullible old woman, easy to manipulate. That was her mistake, and it would be my weapon. But I needed more than instinct. I needed evidence, a way to expose her without putting Danny in danger. And I needed help. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus Chen, my lawyer and former student. Marcus had been a rebellious senior 30 years ago, coasting through my English class with a smirk and a knack for dodging homework. I'd seen potential in him even when he didn't, and I'd pushed him to find it. Now he ran one of the state's top criminal defense firms, and he owed me a favor for not flunking him when he deserved it. If anyone could help me turn Stephanie's trap into one of my own, it was Marcus. I dialed his number, my heart pounding as the line rang. Margaret Walsh. Marcus answered, his voice warm with surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure? No pleasure, Marcus, I said, keeping my voice low as if the walls themselves might be listening. I need your help, and it's urgent. Can you meet me tomorrow morning, somewhere private? His tone shifted, the lawyer in him sensing trouble. My office, 8 a.m. Bring coffee and tell me everything. I hung up, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the dread. Marcus was sharp, and he knew the law better than anyone. If I could get him to craft legal documents that looked legitimate, but hit a trap, I might be able to outmaneuver Stephanie and her partners. But first, I had to face her tonight to play the role she expected, while gathering the evidence I needed. The clock read 7:00 p.m. when I pulled up to Stephanie and Danny's house, a modest two-story I'd helped them buy with a down payment 2 years ago. The gesture had been an investment in Danny's happiness, but now it felt like another thread in Stephanie's web. The house glowed warmly from the outside, its windows spilling light onto the manicured lawn, but the warmth was a lie. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out, clutching my purse like a shield. Inside, it was my phone, set to record a trick I'd learned from dealing with difficult parents during my teaching years. If Stephanie let something slip, I'd have it on tape. Stephanie opened the door before I could knock her face a perfect mask of grief. Red-rimmed eyes, trembling lips, a handkerchief clutched in her hand. Margaret, thank you for coming, she said, her voice breaking just enough to seem real. I know this is hard, but we need to start sorting out Danny's affairs. I nodded, stepping inside my senses on high alert. The house smelled of lavender and deceit, every detail too perfect, like a stage set for a tragedy. She led me to the kitchen, where a stack of documents waited on the table, neatly arranged beside a glass of water and a pen. I found these in Danny's office, she said, gesturing to the papers. They're about his estate, some business dealings, and, well, your Colorado property. My heart skipped, but I kept my face neutral, channeling the confused elderly woman she expected. My property? I asked, tilting my head. What does that have to do with Danny's estate? Stephanie's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching me like a hawk. Danny was handling your estate planning, remember? He wanted to make sure everything was in order for you. She slid a document toward me, her fingers lingering on the page. This is a power of attorney form, giving me control over the land to manage it for you. It's what Danny would have wanted. I picked up the paper, my reading glasses perched on my nose, and scanned the text. It was dense with legal jargon, but I recognized the same forms I'd signed a month ago, mixed with new ones, that would transfer the Colorado land directly to Stephanie. My stomach churned, but I kept my voice light. This seems complicated, dear. Why does it mention a valuation of $12 million? My father's land was never worth anything. Her pupils dilated slightly, a telltale sign of panic she quickly masked. Oh, that's just a placeholder for insurance purposes, she said, her voice smooth as silk. Legal documents need estimated values. It's standard. I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but my mind was racing. $12 million. That was the value of the natural gas reserve Danny had mentioned, the secret Stephanie had known all along. I set the paper down and reached for the water glass, deliberately knocking it over. The liquid spread across the documents, soaking the pages. "Oh, I'm so clumsy," I exclaimed, dabbing at the mess with a napkin. Stephanie's composure slipped for a fraction of a second, her lips tightening, before she rushed to get towels. While she was gone, I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the soggy papers, capturing every detail I could. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. This was evidence proof of her fraud, her greed, her betrayal. When she returned, I was still dabbing at the mess, playing the part of a flustered old woman. "I'm so sorry, dear," I said. "Maybe we should do this another day." "No, it's fine," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I have copies. Let's just focus on the property transfer tonight." She produced a fresh copy of the power of attorney form, her eyes locked on mine, daring me to refuse. I picked up the pen, then paused as if confused. "Will this help with taxes?" I asked innocently. "Absolutely," she said, leaning forward, her eagerness betraying her. "It'll save you thousands. Just sign here." I hesitated, my mind racing. If I signed, I'd be handing her everything. If I refused, I'd tip her off, and Danny's safety depended on her believing I was still in the dark. "You know," I said, setting the pen down, "Danny always told me to have a lawyer look at legal documents first. I think I'll call Marcus tomorrow." The air in the room shifted, a subtle drop in temperature that made my skin prickle. Stephanie's smile became strained, almost feral. "Margaret." "I'm family," she said, her voice low and insistent. "You can trust me. The longer we wait, the more complicated the tax situation becomes." Her tone sent a chill through me, a reminder that this wasn't just about money. She was dangerous, and I was alone in her house, a mouse in a cat's lair. "Of course, dear," I said, standing and gathering my purse. "I just want to be thorough. I'll call my attorney tomorrow." Stephanie's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing. "Sit down, Margaret," she said, her voice no longer soft. "We're not finished here." The shift was jarring, the grieving widow replaced by something predatory. I forced a smile, my survival instincts kicking in. "I'm feeling a bit tired," I said, moving toward the door. "We'll talk soon." She didn't follow, but her gaze burned into my back as I stepped outside the cool night air, a relief after the suffocating tension of her kitchen. The drive home was a blur, every headlight in my rearview mirror a potential threat. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with fury. Stephanie had underestimated me, but so had someone else. As I unlocked my front door, I found it already ajar, the lock forced open. My heart stopped. Someone had been in my house. I stepped inside, my senses on high alert. The living room was lit by my lamps as if I'd left them on, but I hadn't. 3 men sat waiting, their presence as casual as it was menacing. The one in my late husband's recliner was in his 50s, his face forgettable, but his eyes cold like a shark's. The second younger leaned against the wall, his phone in hand, a grainy photo of Danny at the Miller farm glowing on the screen. The third stood by the window, silent but watchful, his bulk blocking the moonlight. Mrs. Walsh, the man in the recliner, said, his voice smooth but laced with threat. "We need to talk." I straightened, summoning the calm authority I'd used on unruly students for decades. "I don't recall inviting anyone into my home," I said. "You'll need to leave." The man smiled, a chilling expression that was worse than a shout. "I'm afraid we can't do that just yet. There's been some confusion about your son's business affairs, and we're here to clear it up." "My son is dead," I said flatly, my heart pounding as I lied. "Whatever business he had died with him. That's the thing," the younger man said, holding up his phone. "This was taken 3 hours ago, near the Miller farm. Your boy doesn't look so dead." I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How had they found him so quickly? Had they followed me? Or had Stephanie known all along? "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear clawing at me. No games, Mrs. Walsh. The man in the recliner said, Your son owes us $2.5 million plus interest. Since he's decided to play dead instead of paying up, we'll collect from you. That Colorado land of yours is worth 10 times that. Sign it over, and Danny can come home. A nice resurrection story. The third man spoke for the first time, his voice low and menacing. Or we find him ourselves and make sure he never bothers us again, along with anyone helping him hide. The threat was clear, a blade held to both our throats. I needed time to think, time to plan. How much time do I have? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Until tomorrow night, the man in the recliner said, standing and straightening his jacket. Stephanie will bring you the papers. Make the right choice, Mrs. Walsh. They left as casually as they'd arrived, leaving me standing in my violated living room, shaking with a mix of rage and determination. 43 years of marriage, 20 years of widowhood, and I'd never felt so helpless or so resolved. These men thought they were dealing with a frightened old woman. They had no idea they'd just picked a fight with someone who'd spent her life outsmarting liars. I drove back to the Miller farm under the cover of darkness, taking back roads and checking my mirrors to ensure I wasn't followed. Danny was waiting inside the barn, pacing like a caged animal, his face pale in the moonlight. They found you, I said without preamble, showing him the photo on my phone, which I'd snapped when the man wasn't looking. They have pictures of you here. His face went white. How I've been so careful. It doesn't matter now, I said, sitting on a crate, feeling the weight of my 67 years. They gave me an ultimatum. Sign over the land by tomorrow night, or they kill us both. Danny ran his hands through his hair, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. Mom, how did I end up owing $2.5 million to these people? I listened as he explained, his voice heavy with regret. It had started small. Stephanie had pitched investment opportunities with private loans, promising huge returns. Danny, eager to build a future, had borrowed $10,000, then $25,000, dazzled by early payouts that seemed too good to be true. They were. The whole thing was a Ponzi scheme, and when it collapsed, Danny was left holding the debt not to banks, but to men like the ones who'd invaded my home, men who broke more than promises when payments were late. Stephanie knew, he said, his voice bitter. Either she's the dumbest person alive, or she's been setting me up from the start. She's not dumb, I said, my voice hard. She's been playing us both. The next morning, I drove to the city to meet Marcus, my hands steady despite the sleepless night. His office was a sleek contrast to my world of dusty barns and small-town secrets, all glass and mahogany, a testament to the boy who'd once failed my Hamlet exam but had grown into a legal shark. Margaret Walsh, he said, standing with a grin. You look like you're about to assign me a 5-page essay. I need something more complicated, I said, accepting his hug, and a lot more dangerous. Over coffee, I laid out the story, Danny's faked death, Stephanie's fraud, the criminals threatening us, the land worth millions. Marcus's expression shifted from amusement to concern, his pen flying across a legal pad as he took notes. You're describing multiple felonies, he said. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, possibly kidnapping if they're holding you under duress. The smart move is to call the FBI now and have Danny arrested for fraud. I shook my head. I want to protect him, Marcus, and I want to make sure these people can't hurt anyone else. He studied me, his eyes narrowing with the same curiosity he'd shown when I'd challenged him to rewrite his midterm essay. What are you proposing? I want to give them what they want, I said, leaning forward. Documents that look like they're getting the land but trap them legally. Something that makes them confess to everything without realizing it. Marcus's smile was slow and approving, like he'd just figured out Hamlet's revenge plot. You want to set a legal landmine? Give me a few hours. 3 hours later, I left his office with a briefcase full of documents that looked like a straightforward property transfer, but were laced with hidden clauses. The papers created a trust with Stephanie as the trustee, but accepting the role required her to report all prior fraudulent activities to federal authorities, effectively confessing to her crimes. If she signed, she'd be handing herself over to the law. If she didn't, she'd get nothing. It was, as Marcus put it, diabolically Shakespearean. I drove home, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The trap was set, but the game was far from over. Stephanie's text came as I pulled into my driveway. "Margaret, I'll bring the papers to the Riverside Diner tonight. 7:00 p.m. It's quieter there. The choice of a public place was clever. She thought it would keep me from making a scene. She had no idea I was counting on witnesses. As I prepared for the meeting, I felt a shift within me. For 42 years, I'd shaped young minds, teaching them to question, to think, to stand up to bullies. Now I was using those same skills to protect my son, to turn a predator's game against her. Stephanie and her allies thought they held all the cards. They were wrong. I was Margaret Walsh, and I was ready to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The Riverside Diner glowed like a beacon in the twilight, its neon sign casting a warm, deceptive light over the parking lot. Inside, the air would smell of coffee and apple pie, a comforting illusion in a town now laced with secrets. I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the weight of Marcus's briefcase heavy on the passenger seat. The documents inside were my weapon, a masterpiece of legal deception crafted to ensnare Stephanie and her criminal allies. Tonight at 7:00 p.m., I would walk into the diner, play the role of a grieving mother-in-law, and spring a trap they'd never see coming. But my heart pounded with the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel everything, putting Danny and me in mortal danger. The diner was my choice, a deliberate one. Stephanie had suggested it, thinking a public place would keep me docile, prevent a scene. She didn't know I'd chosen it for its witnesses. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who ate meatloaf here every Tuesday. Janet Morrison, the prosecutor, who met her book club in the corner booth. Half the town council gossiping over pie. If Stephanie and her partners slipped up, they'd do it in front of people who mattered. I checked my watch, 6:45 p.m., and took a deep breath, steadying myself. For 42 years, I'd faced classrooms of skeptical teenagers, their lies as transparent as glass. Tonight, I was facing a different kind of opponent, but the game was the same. Let them underestimate me, then turn their arrogance against them. I stepped out of the car, the briefcase in hand, my black coat blending into the gathering dusk. The diner's bell jingled as I pushed through the door, the familiar hum of conversation and clinking cutlery wrapping around me. Sheriff Bradley was at his usual table, his uniform crisp, his eyes scanning a stack of reports. Janet Morrison sat with her book club, her laughter carrying across the room. The town councilors were scattered at the counter, their voices a low murmur. Perfect. I claimed my usual booth in the back corner, where I could see the entire restaurant, my back to the wall, like a general surveying a battlefield. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Stephanie walked in her blonde hair, catching the light like a halo, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. Behind her was a man I recognized instantly, the one who'd sat in my husband's recliner the night before, his forgettable face now etched in my memory. She introduced him as David Danny's business partner, but his cold eyes and the way he scanned the room told me he was no partner. He was an enforcer here to ensure I played my part. They slid into the booth across from me. Stephanie's smile tight, David's expression unreadable. I thought this was going to be private. David said, his voice low, his eyes flicking toward Sheriff Bradley's table. It is private. I replied, my tone mild, grandmotherly. No one's paying attention to us. I gestured to the bustling diner where waitresses moved like dancers between tables. But I was watching everything, the way Stephanie's fingers twitched, the way David's jaw tightened when he noticed the sheriff. They were nervous, and that was my first advantage. Stephanie set a manila folder on the table, her movements deliberate. These are the documents we discussed. She said, her voice soft but edged with urgency. The property transfers some insurance paperwork and a few other items that need your signature. I opened the folder, recognizing the forgeries that would have stripped me of the Colorado land if I'd signed them yesterday. The papers were flawless, designed to look legitimate to anyone who didn't know better. But I did. I pushed them aside and opened Marcus's briefcase, pulling out the documents he'd crafted. Actually, I said, placing the new papers on the table, I had my lawyer prepare something more comprehensive. I want to make sure everything is done properly. David's eyes narrowed, his hand pausing on his coffee mug. Your lawyer, he said, his voice flat. Marcus Chen, right? He's thorough. Very, I said, smiling as if we were discussing the weather. He made sure these documents protect everyone's interests. I watched them closely as they opened the folder, their heads bent over pages that looked like a simple property transfer, but were laced with legal poison. Marcus had been brilliant weaving clauses that required the signer to acknowledge prior fraudulent activities and report them to federal authorities. By signing, they'd confess to everything fraud, extortion, conspiracy without realizing it until it was too late. For 20 minutes, I sat patiently as they read, answering their questions with carefully rehearsed explanations. Stephanie flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing at the dense legal text. This seems more complicated than necessary, she said, her voice tinged with irritation. Well, dear, I said, signaling the waitress for more coffee. When you're dealing with millions of dollars, you can't be too careful. Marcus insisted on including provisions to protect against any irregularities in the property's history, liens, fraudulent transfers, criminal activity, that sort of thing. David's head snapped up, his eyes sharp. What kind of irregularities? Oh, the usual concerns, I said, keeping my tone light conversational, ensuring there's no hidden debt, no shady dealings tied to the land. Standard legal protection. I wasn't telling them that signing these documents would legally bind them to confess their crimes, triggering federal jurisdiction. Marcus had buried the trap in technical language, making it invisible to anyone not looking for it. I think we should have our lawyer review this. First, David said, starting to close the folder. Of course, I agreed, easily leaning back in my seat. Though Marcus mentioned that the property tax implications change after midnight tonight. Something about quarterly reporting requirements and federal oversight of high-value mineral rights transfers. It was nonsense, but it sounded official enough to create urgency, a trick I'd learned from years of coaxing students to meet deadlines. Stephanie and David exchanged a glance, a silent conversation I couldn't hear but could feel. What happens after midnight? Stephanie asked, her voice tight. The transfer becomes subject to additional federal scrutiny, I said, shrugging apologetically. It could delay processing for months. Marcus said it's better to handle everything under the current regulations. I don't pretend to understand the legal details. David pulled out his phone, likely to call their lawyer, but it was after 8:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. No legitimate attorney would be available for an emergency consultation. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, then set the phone down. Fine, he said finally. But I want to review every page before we sign. For the next 40 minutes, I watched them pore over the documents, their tension palpable. I sipped my coffee, my heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Every question they asked, every page they turned, brought them closer to the trap. When they finally reached for the pen, I felt a surge of satisfaction, the same thrill I'd experienced watching a struggling student finally grasp a complex concept. They had no idea they were signing their own confession. Stephanie signed first, her signature bold and confident, as if she were claiming a prize. David followed his movements slower, more cautious, but he signed nonetheless. I kept my face neutral, my hands folded in my lap, as if this were just another bureaucratic task. Inside, I was a storm of triumph and fear. The trap was sprung, but the game wasn't over. I needed to get these documents to Sheriff Bradley before Stephanie and David realized what they'd done. "Excuse me," I said, standing and grabbing my briefcase. "I need to use the restroom." I walked calmly toward the back of the diner, my heart pounding, but instead of heading to the ladies' room, I veered toward Sheriff Bradley's table. He looked up from his meatloaf, his eyes narrowing as I sat across from him. "Tom," I said quietly, keeping one eye on Stephanie and David, who were still in the booth whispering to each other. "I need to report multiple felonies, and I have written confessions from the perpetrators." To his credit, Bradley didn't flinch. He set down his fork, his 20 years of police experience evident in the calm way he leaned forward. "Margaret, what's going on?" I opened the briefcase and slid the signed documents toward him, explaining in hushed tones Danny's faked death, Stephanie's fraud, the threats from her criminal partners, the Colorado land worth millions. "These papers," I said, tapping the folder, "make them legally acknowledge their crimes, fraud, extortion, conspiracy. By signing, they've confessed to everything and agreed to cooperate with federal authorities." Bradley skimmed the documents, his eyes widening as he grasped their implications. "This is clever," he said, his voice low, "and completely legal." "Marcus Chen's work, I presume?" I nodded, glancing back at the booth. Stephanie was checking her watch, her impatience growing. "There's more," I said. "Danny's not dead. He faked it to protect himself. They found him, though showed me photos from the Miller farm. I have evidence of their fraud on my phone, and now these confessions." Bradley's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "They threatened to kill you and your son." "Explicitly," I said, pulling out my phone to show him the photos I'd taken of Stephanie's forged documents. "And they're not alone. There are others involved higher-ups. If you arrest Stephanie and David now, the others might slip away." He studied me, his eyes searching mine. "What are you suggesting?" "Give me 5 more minutes," I said, my voice steady. "Let me confirm where they're taking these documents to their bosses. Then you can arrest everyone at once." Bradley hesitated, then nodded. "5 minutes, Margaret." "But if this goes sideways, it won't," I said, standing. "I've been handling difficult people for 42 years. These ones are just better dressed." I returned to the booth, my face a mask of calm. Stephanie and David were visibly agitated, their earlier confidence fraying. "Sorry for the delay," I said, sliding back into my seat. "Where do we go from here?" David relaxed slightly, assuming I was still compliant. "We need to get these documents to our legal team tonight for final processing," he said. "There's a warehouse on Industrial Boulevard where we're meeting them." Tonight, Stephanie added her voice smooth, but her eyes sharp. "The sooner we complete the transfer, the sooner we can all move forward." I nodded, my mind racing. Industrial Boulevard was isolated, perfect for a police raid, but dangerous for me if I went alone. "I suppose you'll need me there to verify my identity," I said, testing them. "No." David said quickly, too quickly. "Your signature is enough. You can go home and rest." Of course they didn't want me there. I was supposed to fade into the background, a grieving mother who'd signed away her legacy. I stood, gathering my things. "Well then," I said, forcing a sad smile, "I guess this is goodbye." Stephanie had the audacity to hug me, her embrace cold and performative. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "Danny would be proud of you." I walked out of the diner, my heart pounding, but my steps steady. Through the window, I saw Bradley finishing his meal, his phone already in hand, likely coordinating with his team. I climbed into my car and drove to a hill overlooking Industrial Boulevard, parking far enough to stay hidden, but close enough to watch. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus FBI confirms your documents trigger federal jurisdiction. They're done. At 10:47 p.m., I watched through binoculars as 3 cars pulled into the warehouse lot. Stephanie and David were in the first, followed by the 2 men from my living room, and a third car with 2 strangers, likely the higher-ups Danny had mentioned. They disappeared inside, oblivious to the unmarked police cars circling the area, their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. Federal agents in tactical gear moved silently surrounding the building like shadows. The megaphone crackled to life, shattering the night. This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. Exit with your hands visible. What followed was anticlimactic, a quiet surrender that felt almost too easy. No gunfights, no chases, just 6 figures emerging with their hands raised, their faces pale in the floodlights. Stephanie's mask of grief was gone, replaced by a scowl of defeat. David's cold eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. I exhaled the tension draining from my body. It was over. My phone rang Bradley's voice, warm with relief. "Margaret, we got them all. Your documents, the photos, the evidence it's enough for federal charges across 6 states. Danny can come home." I closed my eyes, the weight of the past week lifting like fog. "Thank you, Tom," I said, my voice trembling with gratitude. "What happens now?" "We process the evidence, you and Danny give statements, and these people face a long time behind bars. Margaret, you saved more than your family tonight. You stopped a criminal enterprise." As I drove home, the night felt different, clearer, lighter, as if the stars themselves were celebrating. I'd walked into a trap and turned it into a triumph, not with guns or violence, but with the quiet strength of a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life. The diner's neon sign faded in my rearview mirror, a symbol of a battle won, but one final task remained: bringing Danny home. The night air was crisp as I drove home from the hill overlooking Industrial Boulevard, the stars above brighter than they'd been in days, as if the sky itself had exhaled. The warehouse raid had unfolded like a scene from a play I'd directed not with fanfare, but with a quiet, inevitable justice. Stephanie and her criminal allies were in custody, their empire of lies crumbling under the weight of Marcus's cleverly crafted documents and the evidence I'd gathered. My son Danny was safe hidden in the shadows of the Miller farm, waiting for the signal to come home. For the first time in weeks, I felt the knot in my chest loosen, replaced by a warmth I hadn't dared hope for. But the story wasn't over, not yet. There was one final act to play, one last conversation to have, and a new chapter to begin. I pulled into my driveway just before midnight, the familiar silhouette of my house no longer a stage for threats, but a sanctuary reclaimed. The porch light glowed, and there sitting on the steps was Danny, his face pale but alive, his eyes searching mine as I stepped out of the car. The sight of him real breathing, my boy, nearly brought me to my knees. I rushed forward, pulling him into a hug that felt like coming home after a long, perilous journey. His arms tightened around me, his breath ragged against my shoulder. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice thick with a mix of relief and disbelief. "It's over," I said, pulling back to look at him, memorizing every line of his face. "Stephanie and her associates are in federal custody. The land is safe. You're safe." We went inside the house, wrapping us in its familiar creaks and shadows, now comforting rather than menacing. I made coffee, the ritual grounding me, as I set Danny's favorite mug in front of him, a chipped ceramic relic from his college days painted with a faded lighthouse. He sat at the kitchen table, looking older than he had a week ago, the boy who'd trusted too easily replaced by a man who'd learned the cost of betrayal. I sat across from him, the silence between us, heavy with unspoken questions. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low. "When did you know? When did you figure out Stephanie was targeting me?" I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth steady me. Not until the funeral, I admitted. Her grief was too perfect, too staged. But the real confirmation came when she brought those papers to the house. She knew exactly what she wanted and how to manipulate me to get it. It was like watching a student try to talk their way out of a failing grade. Too polished, too calculated. He stared into his mug, his fingers tracing the lighthouse. How long do you think she was planning this? From the beginning, I said the truth, a bitter pill. She researched our family before you met Danny. She knew about the Colorado land, about my father's estate, about the down payment I gave you for the house. She knew I'd do anything to protect you. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of her betrayal. So our entire marriage was a lie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her love, her promises, none of it was real. I reached across the table, taking his hand. Your love was real, I said firmly. You fell for the person she pretended to be. Kind, supportive, someone who made you happy. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human. He looked up, his eyes glistening. I feel like one, though. How do I trust anyone again? It was the question every parent dreads the moment when you see your child's innocence fracture. But it was also a chance to help him rebuild stronger than before. You start by trusting yourself, I said. You learn to spot the red flags, to ask questions, to verify what seems too good to be true. But you don't let fear close you off from the people who deserve your trust. He managed a small smile, the first I'd seen in days. Like you, Mom. You turned out to be a criminal mastermind when I needed you to be. I laughed, the sound surprising me with its lightness. I prefer strategically gifted, I said, echoing my conversation with Marcus. And I learned from you, Danny. The way you protected me by faking your death, the courage it took to disappear, when you realized how dangerous these people were. You're braver than you think. He shook his head, his smile fading. I should have seen through her sooner. I should have been smarter. Sweetheart, I said, squeezing his hand. I lived with your father for 23 years and thought I knew him completely. Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly. What matters is what we do now. What do we do now? He asked, his voice steady but searching. I looked around the kitchen, my home, my life now, secure but forever changed. You move back home, I said. We figure out what to do with a piece of land worth millions. And I go back to volunteering at the library. Except maybe I'll also work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to protect other families from scams like this. His eyes widened. You're going to keep fighting criminals. I'm going to keep protecting people who can't protect themselves, I said, feeling a spark of purpose I hadn't known I possessed. Turns out I'm good at it. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the federal prosecutor handling Stephanie's case. It was a thick envelope, the kind that carries weight beyond its pages. I opened it at the kitchen table, Danny beside me, the morning sun streaming through the window. The letter detailed the charges against Stephanie and her associates, 23 felonies across 6 states, from fraud and extortion to conspiracy and racketeering. The FBI had recovered over $40 million in stolen assets, linking the group to a network of property scams targeting elderly victims nationwide. My testimony, combined with Marcus's ingenious documents and the photos I'd taken, formed the backbone of a case that would likely send them to prison for decades. But the letter held more than legal victories. It included a note from the prosecutor, a woman named Clara Evans, who wrote, "Mrs. Walsh, your courage and ingenuity have not only saved your family, but protected countless others. We'd like to discuss how you might assist our financial crimes unit in identifying vulnerable seniors." I read the words aloud to Danny, my voice catching on the unexpected praise. At 67, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I had, a power, forged not in courtrooms or battlefields, but in the quiet resilience of a mother's love and a teacher's wisdom. Danny leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of pride and wonder. "You're going to be a crime fighter now, Mom." "Not quite," I said, smiling. "But I've spent my life teaching people to think for themselves, to question what they're told. If I can use that to help others, I will." He nodded, his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "What about the land? The gas reserves?" "We'll figure it out," I said. "Maybe we'll sell it. Maybe we'll keep it. But whatever we do, it'll be our choice, not theirs." The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of the life we'd known. Danny moved back into his old room, the one still cluttered with high school trophies and faded posters. He started therapy, working through the betrayal that had shattered his trust. I watched him rebuild step by step, his laughter returning like a melody I'd almost forgotten. I went back to the library, shelving books and reading to children, but I also began meeting with Clara Evans, sharing what I'd learned about spotting scams. Each conversation felt like a small victory, a way to turn our pain into purpose. One evening, as the sun set over our small town, Danny and I sat on the porch, coffee mugs in hand, watching the fireflies dance in the yard. The air was warm, the silence between us comfortable, filled with the unspoken bond that had carried us through. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think I had to protect you, but you're the one who saved me." I reached for his hand, my heart full. "We saved each other," I said. "That's what families do." As the stars emerged, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The funeral had been a lie, but Danny's return was real, a resurrection born of courage and love. I was no longer just Margaret Walsh, retired teacher and widow. I was a woman who'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger, a mother who'd outsmarted a criminal empire, a protector who'd found her purpose. The world had underestimated me, but that underestimation had been my greatest weapon. And as I sat beside my son, the night unfolding around us, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. As the fireflies faded and the night settled around us, I looked at Danny, my son, my strength, and felt a truth settle in my bones. We are never as powerless as we fear. I'm Margaret Walsh, a retired teacher who outsmarted a criminal empire with a mother's love and a teacher's cunning. This story, our story, is proof that courage lies in the quiet moments, in the choice to fight when all seems lost. The shadows may watch, but we can watch back sharper and wiser. If my tale of betrayal and triumph resonates with you, share your own stories of resilience below. Let's uncover the mysteries and truths that shape us together. Subscribe to this journey, hit the bell, and join me each week as we explore the strength hidden within us all. Your voice matters. Tell me, what battles have you fought? And what victories have you claimed? Let's keep the stories alive.